Starting a new message series this morning, and the message series is called Barriers to Belief. And the idea, the impetus behind this message series is this, that over the last 50 years or so, those people, especially in this country, identifying themselves as Christians has reduced significantly. In fact, I've got a chart graph that I found on the internet to help illustrate this. And so this starts in 1972, way back then, the year that I was born. And back then, 90% of Americans identified themselves as Christians. And you can see it's relatively stable there, until into the 80s, maybe late 80s, but then you see what happens. It starts going down, and that goes through 2017. And in 2017, just 63% of Americans identify themselves as Christian. Now, what is the cause of that? And how do you go from, can you imagine 90% of people saying, yeah, I'm Christian? That's so foreign to even think of it that way anymore, because it's just not that way anymore. But what would be interesting is if this graph went back further, because I'm going to speculate that in 1947, it's not like it was at 50%, and between 47 and 72, it went to 90%. I'm going to guess what you would see is, whenever these statistics began, it probably was pretty steady at 90+% of people of this country that identified themselves as Christian. And then it begins this significant drop. And what you can't see in this graph is that the survey also showed that basically older Americans, and as I was just kind of reading through it really quick, I didn't see what they defined as older Americans, but the older Americans identify themselves as Christians at about a rate of 80%. But for younger Americans, that is the youngest of what we consider the adult population, those that are in their 20s, only 50%. Only 50% of young adults in their 20s identify themselves as Christian. What that basically means is we've lost an entire generation of people that don't recognize themselves or consider themselves Christian. And it didn't happen overnight. It's happened especially in the last, maybe 35 or 40 years, but who do you blame? Do we blame our grandparents for that? Do I blame my parents' generation? Do we blame the younger generation? I don't know. But the point is we are to blame. For those of us who are alive now and have been alive as this has happened over the last 35 years, we are the ones to blame. So the real question is why is this going on? And will this trend continue? And so, as I said, this is the impetus for me wanting to do this series, is because I'm personally troubled for my kids and for my grandkids to see this is the trend of faith in America. And so what we're going to be looking at over the next several weeks is we're going to be looking at what are maybe some reasons why. There's probably not just one reason why this is going on. There might be multiple reasons. So the idea is these barriers to belief, these things that keep us and are keeping the younger generation from believing in Jesus Christ. Well, the first one that I want to talk about, I don't know which of these that I'm going to be covering are going to be the greatest or the least reasons, but I think this one is probably somewhat significant. And I would call this scientific knowledge and maybe just intelligence in general, that there's intellectual barriers that keep us from, or at least the younger generations, from believing in God and his son, Jesus Christ. The smarter that we get, it's almost like we don't need God. Now, what you do realize is that there's a giant rift. There's a giant gap between science and religion, between science and Christianity. And it seems like, that's always been the case, that those two are opposed to each other, but that's not the case. It's not the case at all. In fact, some of the leading early scientists were very devout people of faith, people who believed in God. They were priests and they were monks, especially like coming out of the 17th century. And here's what you've got to consider, like modern science, where does it really come from? Modern science really comes from like Western Europe. And why does it flow out of Western Europe and that thought, in that school of thinking? Why is it from that, and why is it not from like older civilizations like China or even the Middle East or Egypt or Africa? Why did it not flow out of those places? And ultimately, it's because it ultimately flows out of Christian thought, that there used to not be this rift. Because the concept was this, is that in Christian thought, you had a creator God that created in an intelligent way, with laws that could be understood. And if God was a God of order and a God of logic, and that's how he created, what Scripture tells us is that you and I were created in his image. And so we ought to be able to figure out and to determine how those processes work, because God is a God of order, and he's created us good and in his image, so that should be discernible to us. So it's out of Christian thought that then, once again, initially these very devout people of faith, priests, monks, went out to try to understand how things work. And so that happened. And the problem is the more that they learned, and the more that we learned of how things work, once we began to learn how things work, we began to deny the Creator, right? And so that's when that rift started taking place between science and religion. And that's really counterintuitive, because it's kind of like saying, hey, I know how a car works, and because I know how a car works, then there must not be a designer of that car. Like that doesn't make sense. Just because you know how an automobile works in the processes doesn't mean that there's not a designer. In fact, the more you know of how it works, it should attest to the fact that there is a designer. Now, this rift between science and religion really was exasperated from the work of Darwin, who came out with his theory of evolution and how things change slowly over time. And we're taught to think that basically from that time of enlightenment within the scientific community and all that Darwin claims to have discovered, which is just a theory anyways, right? That now, like, the people who believe in creation and so forth, those in God, those are just really, ignorant people. They, like, people of knowledge, don't believe in that anymore, and that's not the case. And so what I need you to first understand is that from the time of Darwin on, it's not like people that were brilliant scientists didn't believe still in a God. Not at all. So I'm going to just throw out some names at you. Some of these names are going to be familiar to you from, when you took science in school. Some of these names maybe not, but in the 19th century, during the time of Darwin, there's some brilliant people that still believed in this creator God of the Bible. There's Michael Faraday. He was a brilliant English scientist who studied electromagnetism and electrochemistry. You might not know his name, but you're going to know this next guy's name, at least his last name, James Joule. He was an English physicist. He studied heat and its relationship to mechanical work. And he came up with a unit of energy known as the joule. You probably remember that from school. And if you don't remember him, you probably remember at least, once again, the last name of this next guy, Lord Kelvin. Lord Kelvin was a British mathematical physicist. He was instrumental in formulating the first and the second law of thermodynamics. And he came up with this basic unit of measuring temperature known as the Kelvin scale. He was a devout follower of God. as these others were. There's James Clerk Maxwell, a Scottish physicist. He was responsible for the classic theory of electromagnetic radiation, a devout follower of God. So even in the time of Darwin, it's not like all the educated scientists turned their back on God and the Bible. You have these brilliant physicists that I've mentioned. These were all devout followers of God. And that didn't just end in the 19th century. We also see it in the 20th century. The astronomer physicist, most of these are physicists, understanding the process of order of how things work, right? Arthur Eddington, devout follower of God. You got Nobel laureates in physics, Charles Towns and William Phillips, devout followers of God, Nobel laureate physicists. And then you got Francis Collins, who's director of the Human Genome Project, a devout follower of God. And I love this quote from Francis Collins. He says this: "When something new is revealed about the human genome, I experience a feeling of awe at the realization that humanity now knows something that only God knew." So what I need you to understand is there's this rift between science and religion. We sometimes, for those of us who are believers in the Bible and God, are made to think that we're just kind of ignorant, that real knowledge points away from that, but that's not the case at all. But here's what we got to be careful about. We got to be careful that we don't look to the Bible to be a scientific manual. Like the Bible isn't there to show us all the laws that God has arranged and how things work and the processes by which he set things into motion and he sustains them. The Bible is not a scientific manual, and some people want to try to treat it that way. I remember when I was in college, I took some science class. It was some general science class, and I think someone asked the teacher, how were the Great Lakes formed? And she said, God made them. And I sat there and I thought, I'm paying a lot for this class. I kind of wanted to hear a different answer than that. I mean, he may have, when he called things into existence, he may have just dug those babies out like right there and then. Or maybe these processes he put into place, whether that is, the expanse of glaciers and them retreating or whatever, what scientifically looks like how those came into being. Like if it was done through something like that, that doesn't discount the Bible, because the Bible is not a scientific manual. It's there to tell us how God called all things into being, but it's not meant to give us that kind of detail, and we shouldn't use it that way. Now, for the remainder of our time this morning, as the science and knowledge and intellect is a big barrier, I think, especially for younger people to believe. I'm going to get a little brainy on you, but I want to give like 4 keys in which we've got to keep straight that will distinguish between what is really a belief system of the scientific community, and it is a belief system because it's a theory. It's not provable, right? And then there's the belief system of Christianity. These are 2 separate belief systems, but 4 points that I just want to kind of use to differentiate those belief systems. And the first is this: is you have to understand the concept of creation versus evolution. Look at Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 5. We see that God creates. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was formless and it's empty, and I've got that underlined. I want you to pay attention to that. The earth, there's no form. It's empty. It's without having anything. Darkness existed over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, and God said, let there be light. And there's light. And God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and he called the darkness night. And there's evening, and there's morning in the first day. Every day of creation's like that. It doesn't exist until God calls it into existence. We have a real fancy theological term for how God does this, and it's ex nihilo. That is out of nothing. It's not like God took a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and then he created land, or a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and he created, water, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and he created light. Out of nothing, he calls those things into existence. This is the concept of creation. Now, we are made in the image of God. We like to create, but we do not create ex nihilo. We do not create out of nothing. I like to create in the kitchen when I cook. I oftentimes don't even look at a recipe. I just want to grab, I've got in my mind what might taste good. And so, people will say, well, how'd you make that? And I'm like, I don't know. I just grab some of this and grab some stuff out of the fridge and that, and maybe put a little oil here, and then you just cook it up and mix it together, and you have it, right? That's not creating out of nothing. I take things that exist, and from that I create. You do the same thing. You do a project at your house. Maybe you're building a fence or building, a shed or something like that. So you go to Home Depot and then you buy some wood and you buy some nails or you buy some screws and you get some shingles or whatever it is that you're getting. You get all of those pieces together and you create something, you make something, but you don't do that out of nothing. You do that out of something. And this ultimately gets into the fundamental difference between people who believe in the Bible and creation and those, especially in the scientific community, that do not, that believe in evolution. These are two fundamentally different belief systems, and I'm going to use that term again and again and again. They're different belief systems. One is a belief that God creates out of nothing and makes something, and the other believes that something turns in, one thing turns into something, or let me say it another way, this will turn into that, which will turn into that. And from that, you might get that, and then from that, you get that, and from that, you get that. But ultimately, this turns into that. But here's the problem. The problem with evolution is they don't know how you get to this. They believe that this turns into that. And listen, that's arguable, and that could be just another hour-plus message up here in and of itself. I'm not even going to concede to you that this turns into that, because there's very little proof that even goes on. But what they can't ultimately say is, where do you get this from? So that it can turn into that. With creation, with God, you don't have that problem, because out of nothing, you don't have this. You have God calling it into existence, and all of a sudden you have that. You don't got to go from this to that and explain how you get this. God calls it all into existence. In which logically makes more sense. As you go back to the car analogy, like if you end up with a working car, which is what we have today, like according to creation, you have a God who calls it into existence, and right away it is a working car. The other, like, you got to start with a hubcap or something. And over time, that hubcap's going to transform itself into a tire, and that tire into maybe the frame of a car, into the exhaust, and to the engine, and to a windshield, and to windshield wipers, and all this. I mean, which takes more faith? The second point that we got to keep straight when we try to understand this rift that's developed between science and religion is this concept between it being good immediately, or it's fixing to be good after a long period of time. Because when we look at the Bible, when we look at God's creation version, it's good immediately. It's not fixing to be good. Look, and I've talked about this before. So after every day of creation, God declares it's good. But after the last day of creation, he says something very special. Look at Genesis 1:31. God saw all that he made, and it was very good. It was exceedingly good. It was great. It was perfect. And there's evening and there's morning, and there's a sixth day. You see, this is different than the science of in the theory of evolution, because in the theory of evolution, things don't start off in their great form. In the Bible, according to the Bible, he creates it mature. He creates it extremely functional. He creates it great. In terms of evolution, you go from simple to more complex. And in general, simple is not as good, and more complex is better. So you go from worse to better. You go from disorder to increasing order. That according to evolution, over time, things will keep getting better and better and better. And let me just ask you, is that how you observe life around you? When you look at your life, when you look at this world, do you notice over time things just keep getting better? How about your house? Have you found that after your house is 20 years old, it's a lot better than what it was when you initially got it? No, it's actually the opposite. My goodness, like I can't even, like it seems like every other day something's breaking around this church again, and the church is now 21 or so years old. I can tell you the amount that we allocate, and it wasn't nearly enough this year for repairs that we're not anticipating. The amount that we allocate this year is a lot more than what it was last year, a lot more than what it was 5 years ago. And when the church was just 2 or 3 years old, we didn't have to allocate really anything for that because things don't break, because when it's new, it starts out in its good form, and as it ages and over time, it goes from good to less good. Consider your car, it's the same. I mean, do you celebrate, man, I got 150,000 miles on my car, this puppy's gonna be really good now? No, I mean, I've got one that's got 120,000 on it, and I took it into the shop for a check engine light. He's like, well, this is how much it's going to be to fix this, but man, I'm looking at this, and you got this, and this going on, and you're going to need to get that fixed soon. And I'm like, well, time to get a new car. Why? Because a new car, or a car with just a few thousand miles on it, isn't going to have nearly as many problems as one that's got 150,000 miles on it. Why? Because over time, things don't get better, they get worse. Consider yourself. If you're over 30, are you getting better with time? I mean, let's be honest. No. I mean, the knees are starting to hurt when you go upstairs. You're not as fast as you used to be. Your mind is maybe not as sharp as what it is. Like, yeah, maybe if you're on the lower side of, say, 25 or 26, you're like, yeah, I'm getting better. But I'm telling you, like once 30 hits, that's not the case. Like over time, we're going to get worse. It's the same thing with the sun. The sun's dying. The earth is dying. Our solar system is dying. Things are going from great order to more disorder. Things get worse with time. They don't get better. That's opposite of what evolution says. What do you observe with your own eyes? And so once again, these are two different belief systems. So if you believe in evolution, then that things get better over time, there's got to be a great amount of time where you get from like not good at all to what we have today. And so like you have to have millions of years for there to be soil, because the concept is things don't start like, great. They start just okay. In fact, they start pretty bad. So you got all rock, and you need soil to plant, and you need soil to live and soil to exist. So there's going to be a long period of time for that. There's going to be a long period of time for, 1 billion years for some of those stars, for that light to get here and for us to be able to see, because the concept is it didn't start out that way. It started out that like those started way out there then, and you need that time for that light to get there. You need time. Like if I hand you a seed and you're hungry tonight, and it's a peach tree seed, I'm not helping you out that much. Why? Because it's going to take a significant amount of time for that seed to go into the ground and then germinate, and then that tree's got to grow for 3 to 5 years before it's going to only give you a few pieces of fruit, right? Like everything's going to take time according to evolution. But you see, that's different than what the Bible says, this concept that there's a creator God, which evolution denies. The creator God says when he created it, it's good. It was exceedingly good. It was functional. If God's just creating a bunch of rock, he's not going to sit there and say, man, this is good. It wouldn't be good. It'd be pretty stinky. If it took 1 billion years for, light to get here, that's not that helpful, right? I mean, if the stars are to help people navigate and for signs and seasons and all, it's not a really helpful thing, God, if it's going to take 1 billion years for this to work out. If animals and people need to eat the fruit of trees and so forth, and it's going to take 3 or 5 years for that to produce fruit, that's not good. So as God creates things not fixing to be good in a billion years, not fixing to be good in a million years, not fixing to be good, in 5 years. He creates it good in its moment. He even does that in terms of like humanity. If God had created Adam and Eve and they were 1 day old, would that have been good? No, it would have been horrible. They would have died within a day or two. If God would have created them in our terms 99 years old, and would say in our terms, it's back then they lived 800, 900, 1,000 years old, but in our terms, if God had created Adam and Eve as a 99-year-old, would that have been good? No, it really wouldn't have been that good. Listen, I'm here to tell you, a 1 day old baby, they're cute. A 99-year-old, they're cute, but neither of them are great, no offense intended. When God creates, he creates things at its peak and at its perfection. And because of sin, what we see is that things don't get better with time. They actually get worse. They deteriorate. They move to disorder. It moves to death. And guess what? That's what we observe, not only in ourselves, our homes, our cars, we observe it in the solar system, in galaxy, and universe itself. Which belief system is easier to believe? Third point, God is a God of order. Paul argues for order and worship based upon that God is a God of order. He says you have to have order and worship because we worship a God of order. Look at 1 Corinthians 14:33. For God is not a God of disorder. He's a God of peace. God isn't a God of disorder. God is a God of order. And part of God's order is that he doesn't ever change. So the God of order as he created this world is also the God of order as he sustains it. Malachi 3:6 says this, the Lord does not change. So what we would expect that when we see God, if God is a God of order, then when we look at his creation, and this is why modern day science came from Christianity, you would expect that you would find order in creation, and that's actually what you find. That God orders our days in terms of time. God orders things in terms of seasons, thankfully. After hopefully a couple more weeks, we're going to be done with summer, right? And there's none of us trying to figure out what's going to come next. Hey, I wonder what comes after summer this year. No, it's going to be fall. And you don't have to guess what's going to come after fall. It's going to be winter. And you don't have to guess what's going to come after winter because it's going to be spring. How do we know this? Because God's a God of order. It would be disorder and chaos if winter followed summer and spring followed fall or whatever. If it was just a jumbled, there'd be no order in that. We see order in the laws of nature when we think about the laws of gravity. When we look at the speed of light, those are all constants, right? There's order. Where there's cause, there will be effect. Why? Because there's order. Where there's actions, there's going to be reactions and consequences. Why? Because there's order to it all. In fact, in any place in which something seems random, it's not because it is random. It's just we don't have the knowledge yet to know how it works. Because there's order in everything. And the scriptures say that even without seeing God, just by looking at his creation, you can see evidence of God and his order. Look at Psalm 19, 1-4. It says, the heavens declare the glory of God. See, when you look at the heavens, you can see the glory of God. The skies will proclaim the works of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. You see, they have no speech. They don't use words. No sound can be heard from them, yet their voice goes out. Why? Because they declare the order of the God who created them. And though there's this order out there, the scientific community doesn't want to acknowledge it. Why? Because if you acknowledge that there's order, if you acknowledge that there's a creator God, if you acknowledge there's intelligent design, then now you're answerable to God rather than to no one. And they don't want to be answerable to God. So there's this huge persecution, if you will, that goes on against anyone who believes in what I've been teaching you in terms of the creation declaring intelligent design. If Whether you're Baylor University, a Christian university down in Waco, if you promote intelligent design, you're going to be cut off from the government in terms of funding for any of your science programs, because they're just persecuting anyone who, and withholding anyone who would produce any kind of thought, any free thought, apart from this concept of the Darwinian theory of evolution. If you're not aware of just how coordinated and intentional this movie's like, I don't know, 17 years old now, but Ben Stein did that movie. It's called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. And basically he exposes that the National Academy of Sciences and all of this stuff literally prevents anyone from promoting this concept of intelligent design, even though it all fits that way better than it does the theory of evolution. You ought to watch it sometime. Now, even though God is a God of order and he set up all the laws, here's what's unique about God is he creates these laws and he can set them into motion, and he does, but he can change them at will. Kind of like the NFL and the kickoff rule. Is anyone else annoyed by that, by the way? I digress. But God has created these laws, he's created these orders, but at times he suspends them. What do we call it? When something does not follow the laws of nature, what do we call it? A miracle, right? And we see that in Scripture when Moses and the Israelites are being chased by the Egyptians, and when the water splits and they go on dry land, that doesn't happen. That shouldn't happen. That violates a lot of laws of nature. Well, that's a miracle. The Star of Bethlehem, right? Like, what was that about? That light in the sky that led the wise men to where the Christ child was. That may very well have been setting aside some of the laws of nature. There's a story in the Old Testament where Israel's in battle, and God literally makes the sun stand still in the sky and the day to stretch out so that the battle could be fought in the light of day. That's violating the laws that God sets up, but God can violate the laws that he sets up. Here's another story about how God does that from Isaiah 38. King Hezekiah was told that he was going to die, and there was an army that was about to overtake the city, and God violates the laws of the sun, basically, in order to prove to him that he was going to lengthen his days and save him from this attack from their enemies. Look at Isaiah 38, 1-8. Now, in those days, Hezekiah became ill, and he was at the point of death. And so the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos, went to him and said, "This is what the Lord says, put your house in order, because you're going to die, and you will not recover." Hezekiah was so upset, he turned his face to the wall, and he prayed to the Lord, "Remember, Lord, I have walked before you faithfully and with wholehearted devotion, and I have done what is good in your eyes." And Hezekiah wept bitterly. And then the word of the Lord came to Isaiah, "Go back and tell Hezekiah this. This is what the Lord, the God of your father David says. I have heard your prayer. I've seen your tears. I'm adding 15 years to your life. And I'm going to deliver you and the city from the hand of the king of Assyria. I will defend the city. And this is the Lord's sign to you, that the Lord will do what he has promised. I will make the shadow cast by the sun go back 10 steps as it has gone down the stairway of Ahaz." And so the sunlight went back 10 steps as it had gone down. So you have the stairway, and as light's going through it, it's moving forward. It moves back 10 steps. God's violating the laws. He sets these laws into motion, but he's supreme over them. In times, in miraculous cases, we see that he can actually go against them and break them because he's the one that created them. Lastly, I want to point out this, that God who sustains, God who's created all these things, he sustains everything that he creates. And without him, they'll cease to exist. In other words, they might say, you know what, the sun has this many million years before it burns out, and then life will cease to exist. No, life will cease to exist when God removes himself from this creation. Look at Colossians 1:17. He is before all things, and in him all things are held together. Look at Job 34:14 and 15. if it were his intention, if it was God's intention, if God withdrew his spirit and his breath, all humanity would perish together and mankind would return to the dust. The only reason you and I are here is because God wills it. If he removes himself from it, all the processes that he's put into place would cease to exist. It's kind of like I'm up here talking, I'm sharing this with you. Like if he causes my heart to stop, I'm going to drop. I still have a mouth, I still have a brain, I still have my fingers, everything. But if he removes that, like I'm done. If you take the battery out of the watch, it stops working. You take the battery out of the car, I mean, you still have the steering wheel, you still have the engine, you still have the tires. It ain't going anywhere. If God removes himself from this creation, it ceases to exist. And we're told that that's exactly what he's going to do one day. That Christ is going to return and that he's going to judge the living and the dead, and the old earth and the old heavens are going to pass away, and he's going to create a new order. And that new order is going to be this, that like there will be no end. The new order is this: the house that you live in, it might be 1,000,000 years old, but you're not going to get a roof leak. The new order is your car might have 1,000,000,000,000 miles on it, but you know what? You might not even need an oil change. You might be 3 trillion years old and your knees aren't even going to hurt going upstairs. Why? Because this process that was introduced because of sin, that is that we go from full order to disorder, that you've got that process of death, that's going to be done away with. And the new order is like it will constantly stay in that perfect state. What I want you to get from what I've shared with you today is that ultimately we have two different belief systems. And we have this rift that is developed between science and religion because just because we know how the car works, we think that there doesn't need to be a creator of it. But I'm here to tell you that when you understand the beauty of how that car works, it attests to the fact that there is a designer to it, that there is a creator to it. And in the end, science and humanity does not want there to be a God, because if there is a God, they're answerable to that God. If there's not a God, we can do whatever we want with creation. Mind you, we can't, like I said, we can't create. We can only monkey with creation. So we can't make a man, we can't make a woman, but we can monkey with when God makes a man, can't we? Because we're learning how things work, you give enough hormones, we can kind of make that man into a woman now. And you can kind of make that woman into man. And I say kind of, right? Like we can take what God gives and we can monkey with it, but we're not the creator, God is. And if we're the creator, we can do that and it's fine. If we're the creator, we can stop the process of life forming and abort babies, and it's fine because we don't have to answer to a God. So my question to you is, which belief system do you want to believe in? Which is easier for you to believe in? Is it easier for you to believe in the fact that God out of nothing calls all things into existence and it's great? Or are you going to believe in a system that can't even answer how you get to this that turns into that? Are you going to believe in a belief system that thinks that working car somehow came from, like, once again, a hubcap that became a tire, that became the frame, that became this? For me, it takes a whole lot more belief to believe in that than it does a God who says, out of nothing, I will create it, and it is good. Would you join me in a word of prayer? Gracious Almighty God, we just thank and praise you for this morning, and I just pray that as we live in a society that is increasingly turning its back on you, there's a lot of barriers to unbelief, and I just pray that you'd help us to, especially when it comes to science and knowledge, that we would look to the Bible for what it's meant to teach, and what it does teach us is that there is a good God who creates in logic and order. And we thank you, gracious God, that you've given us the ability, because we've been made in your image, to understand that. But help us to see that to point to you rather than to point away. In Jesus' holy and precious name, amen.